Ambrose Burnside was a Rhode Island gentleman and a complex military figure who became one of the most controversial commanders of the Civil War. Ambrose Everett Burnside, Union general and later politician, was born in Liberty, Indiana on May 23, 1824. He came from a modest family. He had a distinctive appearance with his famous facial hair. Burnside's early years were marked by ambition and determination. He attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, graduating in 1847, ranking 18th in a class of 38 cadets. His education there shaped his understanding of military tactics and leadership, though his later career would test those lessons in the most brutal ways imaginable. After graduating from West Point, Burnside was assigned to the artillery and sent to Mexico, though he arrived too late to see significant action in the Mexican-American War. He was stationed at Fort Adams in Newport, Rhode Island, and later served in the Southwest during the Apache Wars. It was during this time that Burnside began developing his ideas about military equipment and weaponry. In 1853, Burnside resigned from the army to pursue a business venture. He had invented a breech-loading rifle, the Burnside carbine, which he believed would revolutionize warfare. He established the Bristol Firearms Company in Rhode Island to manufacture his invention. The rifle was innovative for its time, featuring a unique cartridge design that allowed for faster reloading than traditional muzzle-loading weapons. Burnside's business venture initially showed promise. His carbine attracted attention from military officials and sportsmen alike. However, despite the technical merits of his design, the business side of the enterprise proved challenging. Burnside was a better inventor than businessman. He struggled with production costs, marketing, and competition from other firearms manufacturers. By 1857, his company had failed, leaving him deeply in debt. The failure was devastating both financially and personally. Burnside had invested everything into this venture, and its collapse left him nearly bankrupt. He was forced to sell his patents and personal property to satisfy creditors. This period of his life taught him humility and resilience, qualities that would serve him throughout his later military career. After his business failure, Burnside moved to Illinois, where he found work with the Illinois Central Railroad. He became the treasurer of the railroad company, a position that provided stability and allowed him to rebuild his life. During this time, he also became involved with the Illinois militia, serving as a major general. His military bearing and West Point training made him a natural leader in the volunteer forces. When the Civil War erupted in April 1861, Burnside was quick to answer the call. He helped organize the 1st Rhode Island Infantry, one of the first volunteer regiments to respond to President Lincoln's call for troops. Burnside was appointed colonel of the regiment and led them to Washington. His unit was among the first to arrive in the capital to defend it against potential Confederate attack. Burnside's regiment participated in the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. The battle was a disaster for the Union forces, but Burnside's performance was considered adequate given the chaos of the engagement. Following Bull Run, he was promoted to brigadier general. The promotion reflected both his West Point credentials and his political connections in Rhode Island and Illinois. In the fall of 1861, Burnside was given command of an expeditionary force tasked with operations along the North Carolina coast. This assignment would prove to be the high point of his military career. Burnside's Burnside Expedition, as it came to be known, was remarkably successful. In February 1862, his forces captured Roanoke Island, defeating the Confederate garrison there. This victory gave the Union control of Albemarle Sound and threatened Confederate positions throughout eastern North Carolina. Following the success at Roanoke Island, Burnside's forces captured New Bern in March 1862 and Fort Macon in April. These victories secured Union control of the North Carolina coast and provided bases for future operations. The campaign was one of the few bright spots for the Union in the early months of 1862. Burnside's success earned him promotion to Major General and national recognition. Newspapers praised him as one of the Union's most capable commanders. His distinctive appearance, particularly his unusual facial hair, made him instantly recognizable. The style of whiskers he wore, connecting his sideburns to his mustache while leaving his chin clean-shaven, would eventually be named after him, though with the syllables reversed, Sideburns. In July 1862, Burnside was called north to take command of the Ninth Corps in the Army of the Potomac. He participated in the Second Battle of Bull Run in August, though his corps saw limited action. When General John Pope's army was defeated, Burnside's corps helped cover the retreat back to Washington. The following month, Burnside played a crucial role in the Battle of Antietam. His corps was tasked with attacking the Confederate right flank by crossing a stone bridge over Antietam Creek. The bridge, which would later bear his name, became the site of intense fighting. Burnside's troops struggled for hours to cross the bridge against determined Confederate resistance. When they finally succeeded in crossing, their advance came too late in the day to exploit the breakthrough. The delay at what became known as Burnside's Bridge has been the subject of debate among historians ever since. After Antietam, General George McClellan, commander of the Army of the Potomac, was removed from command due to his failure to pursue the retreating Confederate army. President Lincoln needed a replacement, and he offered the position to Burnside. Burnside twice declined the command, recognizing his own limitations. He did not believe himself qualified to command such a large army. He understood that armor-level command required skills and judgment he was not certain he possessed. However, Lincoln insisted, and Burnside felt he could not refuse a direct order from the president. In November 1862, Ambrose Burnside reluctantly accepted command of the Army of the Potomac. It was a decision that would define his legacy and haunt him for the rest of his life. Burnside immediately reorganized the army, creating 3 grand divisions to streamline command and control. He then developed a plan to move quickly toward Richmond, the Confederate capital, before winter weather made campaigning impossible. His strategy called for crossing the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg, Virginia, then advancing on Richmond before General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia could react. The plan had merit if executed quickly, but delays in the arrival of pontoon bridges gave Lee time to concentrate his forces at Fredericksburg. By the time Burnside was ready to cross the river in early December, Lee's army was entrenched on the heights overlooking the town. Despite the obvious strength of the Confederate position, Burnside decided to proceed with his attack. On December 11, 1862, Union engineers began laying pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock under fire from Confederate sharpshooters in Fredericksburg. After clearing the town, Burnside spent 2 days positioning his forces, giving Lee even more time to strengthen his defenses. On December 13, Burnside ordered a series of frontal assaults against the Confederate positions. The main attack was directed against Marye's Heights, where Confederate infantry stood deep behind a stone wall at the base of the hill, with artillery positioned on the heights above. The position was nearly impregnable. Wave after wave of Union soldiers advanced across open ground toward the stone wall. Confederate fire cut them down by the hundreds. Brigade after brigade was sent forward, each attack ending in slaughter. The carnage was appalling. Union soldiers fell in heaps before the stone wall, unable to reach the Confederate line. By the end of the day, the Union had suffered over 12,000 casualties. The Confederates lost fewer than 5,000 men. It was one of the most one-sided battles of the entire war. Burnside was devastated by the disaster. He reportedly wept as he watched his men being slaughtered. He even proposed to personally lead his old Ninth Corps in another assault the next day, but his subordinates talked him out of it. The Battle of Fredericksburg was an unmitigated disaster for the Union cause and for Burnside personally. In the aftermath of Fredericksburg, Burnside's army remained encamped across the river from the Confederate positions. Morale was shattered. The soldiers had lost confidence in their commander. Burnside's officers began to openly criticize him and plot against him. In January 1863, Burnside attempted to restore his reputation with a new offensive. He planned to cross the Rappahannock upstream from Fredericksburg and flank Lee's position. The movement began on January 20th, but almost immediately the weather turned against them. Heavy rains turned the roads into rivers of mud. Wagons, artillery, and even pontoon boats became hopelessly mired. Soldiers struggled through knee-deep mud, unable to make progress. The offensive, which became known as the Mud March, was abandoned after 2 days. It was a humiliating end to Burnside's tenure with the Army of the Potomac. Following the Mud March, Burnside attempted to reassert his authority by ordering the dismissal of several subordinate officers who had been disloyal. However, President Lincoln intervened and instead removed Burnside from command of the Army of the Potomac. It was a bitter pill for Burnside to swallow, but he accepted the decision with dignity. He was reassigned to command the Department of the Ohio, a position that removed him from the main theater of the war in the East. In his new command, Burnside was responsible for security in the border states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. This was a politically sensitive position, as these states contained significant numbers of Confederate sympathizers known as Copperheads. Burnside took a hard line against dissent, issuing General Order No. 38, which declared that anyone committing treason or expressing sympathy for the enemy would be subject to military trial and execution. The most controversial action under this order was the arrest of Clement Vallandigham, a former Ohio congressman and prominent Copperhead. Vallandigham had given speeches criticizing the Lincoln administration and the war effort. Burnside had him arrested, tried by military commission, and sentenced to imprisonment for the duration of the war. The case became a national controversy, raising questions about civil liberties and military authority in wartime. Lincoln, embarrassed by the situation, commuted Vallandigham's sentence to banishment to the Confederacy. The incident damaged Burnside's reputation further and highlighted his tendency toward heavy-handed action without considering the broader political implications. In the fall of 1863, Burnside led his troops into East Tennessee as part of a campaign to secure that region for the Union. East Tennessee was strongly Unionist in sentiment, and its liberation had been a priority for Lincoln. Burnside's forces occupied Knoxville in September 1863. However, when the Union Army was defeated at Chickamauga in Georgia, Confederate forces under General James Longstreet were sent to recapture Knoxville. Burnside found himself besieged in the city with limited supplies and no immediate prospect of relief. The siege lasted from November 17 to December 4, 1863. Burnside's forces successfully defended the city against several Confederate assaults, most notably at Fort Sanders, where a Confederate attack was repulsed with heavy losses. When Union forces under General William Sherman approached, Longstreet withdrew, ending the siege. The successful defense of Knoxville was a bright spot in Burnside's otherwise troubled military record. In early 1864, Burnside returned to command of the 9th Corps, now serving under General Ulysses S. Grant in the Overland Campaign against Lee's army in Virginia. The 9th Corps fought in the battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. These were brutal, grinding battles of attrition that characterized Grant's strategy of constant pressure on the Confederate army. Burnside's corps performed adequately in these engagements, though not with particular distinction. The corps suffered heavy casualties, as did all of Grant's forces during this campaign. By June 1864, Grant's army had reached Petersburg, Virginia, and settled into siege operations. The 9th Corps took its place in the Union lines surrounding the city. It was at Petersburg that Burnside became involved in one of the most infamous incidents of the Civil War, the Battle of the Crater. Union soldiers from the 48th Pennsylvania Infantry, many of whom had been coal miners before the war, proposed digging a tunnel under the Confederate fortifications and exploding a massive mine. The plan was approved, and over the course of a month, the miners dug a 500-foot tunnel and packed it with 4 tons of gunpowder. The mine was exploded before dawn on July 30, 1864, creating an enormous crater and killing hundreds of Confederate soldiers. The explosion was the signal for a Union assault that was supposed to exploit the breach in the Confederate lines. However, the assault was badly mismanaged from the start. The division that was supposed to lead the attack had not been properly prepared. Soldiers advanced into the crater itself rather than around it, becoming trapped in the massive hole. Confederate forces recovered from their initial shock and counterattacked, pouring fire into the crater. Union soldiers, including several regiments of United States colored troops, were slaughtered in the crater. The battle became a massacre. By the end of the day, Union forces had suffered over 4,000 casualties while achieving nothing. Burnside was blamed for the disaster, though the fault was shared by several commanders. A court of inquiry found that Burnside had failed to properly supervise the attack. Shortly after the Battle of the Crater, Burnside went on leave and never returned to active command. His military career effectively ended in that blood-soaked crater outside Petersburg. In April 1865, Burnside formally resigned from the army. The war ended just days later with Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Burnside had served his country for 4 years of brutal warfare, experiencing both triumph and tragedy. His military record was mixed at best. He had shown ability as a corps commander and in independent operations like the North Carolina Coast Campaign and the defense of Knoxville. However, his performance as commander of the Army of the Potomac had been disastrous, and the Battle of the Crater had ended his career on another note of failure. Historians have generally judged Burnside as a capable subordinate commander who was promoted beyond his abilities. He himself had recognized this, which made his failures all the more tragic. After the war, Burnside returned to Rhode Island and resumed his business career. He became involved in railroad management and other business ventures, this time with more success than his pre-war firearms company. He also entered politics, serving as governor of Rhode Island for 3 one-year terms from 1866 to 1869. As governor, he focused on veterans' affairs and industrial development. He was popular with voters and respected for his war service despite his military setbacks. In 1874, Burnside was elected to the United States Senate, representing Rhode Island. He served in the Senate until his death, focusing on military affairs and veterans' pensions. He was known as a genial colleague who maintained friendships across party lines. His distinctive appearance and friendly manner made him a well-known figure in Washington society. Throughout his post-war years, Burnside remained active in veterans' organizations and maintained his connection to the military community. He served as the first president of the National Rifle Association, which had been founded in 1871 to promote marksmanship training. He also remained involved with various business enterprises, serving on corporate boards and investing in new ventures. Burnside married Mary Richmond Bishop in 1852, but the marriage was unhappy and they had no children. His personal life was marked by the same mixture of success and disappointment that characterized his military career. On September 13, 1881, Ambrose Burnside died suddenly at his home in Bristol, Rhode Island. He was 57 years old. The cause of death was reported as neuralgia of the heart, what would today likely be called a heart attack. Burnside's funeral was attended by thousands, including many of his former soldiers and fellow officers. He was buried in Swan Point Cemetery in Providence, Rhode Island. In death, as in life, Burnside was remembered with a mixture of respect and regret. His legacy is complex and contradictory. He was a man of genuine personal courage and integrity who found himself in situations beyond his abilities. He was honest about his limitations, yet he accepted commands he knew he was not qualified to hold. He cared deeply about his soldiers, yet his decisions led thousands of them to their deaths at Fredericksburg and the Crater. He was loyal to the Union cause and served faithfully throughout the war, yet his service was marked by more failures than successes. Modern historians have been somewhat kinder to Burnside than his contemporaries were. They recognize that he was placed in impossible situations, particularly at Fredericksburg where political pressure forced him to attack a nearly impregnable position. They note that his subordinates at Fredericksburg failed to execute his orders properly, contributing to the disaster. They acknowledge that the Battle of the Crater was mismanaged by multiple commanders, not just Burnside. Yet even with these qualifications, the verdict on Burnside's military career remains largely negative. He was a good man and a decent general who was promoted beyond his capacity and paid the price in reputation and legacy. His name became synonymous with military incompetence, which is unfortunate given his genuine abilities at lower levels of command and his personal qualities of courage and integrity. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Ambrose Burnside comes from his own recognition of his limitations. Unlike many failed generals who blamed others or circumstances for their defeats, Burnside accepted responsibility for his failures. After Fredericksburg, he publicly took full blame for the disaster. This honesty and humility, while admirable, could not erase the consequences of his mistakes. Burnside represents a particular type of military leader, the capable subordinate who fails when given supreme command. History is full of such figures, men who excel at executing others' plans but lack the strategic vision and judgment needed for independent command. Burnside's tragedy was that he knew this about himself but was unable to avoid the promotion that would expose his limitations to the world. In the end, Ambrose Burnside was neither a great general nor a terrible one, but rather a competent officer who was asked to do more than he was capable of doing. His legacy includes both the successful North Carolina campaign and the defense of Knoxville, as well as the disasters at Fredericksburg and the crater. He is remembered today primarily for his facial hairstyle and for his failures, which is perhaps unfair to a man who served his country faithfully in both war and peace. Burnside was even in death a man of contradictions, remembered for his distinctive appearance and his military failures rather than for his genuine service and his personal integrity. Thaddeus Stevens was a Pennsylvania lawyer and fierce abolitionist who became one of the most powerful voices for equality in American history. Thaddeus Stevens, the radical Republican congressman, was born in Danville, Vermont on April 4, 1792. He came from humble beginnings. He had a clubfoot that marked him from birth. Stevens's family struggled with poverty throughout his childhood. He was educated despite his family's financial hardships, attending Dartmouth College where he graduated in 1814. When he left Vermont, he moved to Pennsylvania to start his career as a teacher and then as a lawyer. In 1816, his mother's sacrifices to educate him paid off and the young Stevens established a law practice in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Thaddeus Stevens never married, though he maintained a long relationship with his housekeeper Lydia Hamilton Smith, a mixed-race woman. In the 1820s, when slavery was deeply embedded in American society, Stevens began defending fugitive slaves without charge. He risked his reputation and his safety to protect those fleeing bondage. Stevens was drawn into politics by his fierce opposition to slavery and his belief in equal rights for all men. In 1833, Stevens was elected to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. He fought against the expansion of slavery into new territories. He championed public education, believing that free schools were essential to democracy. Stevens helped establish Pennsylvania's public school system in the 1830s despite fierce opposition from those who didn't want to pay taxes for education. He was a master debater in the state legislature. His sharp tongue and sharper mind made him feared by his opponents. Stevens left the state legislature in 1841, but his passion for justice never wavered. He continued his law practice and became increasingly wealthy from his investments in iron manufacturing. The ironworks he owned employed both white and black workers at a time when such integration was virtually unheard of. In 1848, Stevens was elected to the United States House of Representatives as a member of the Whig Party. He arrived in Washington as a committed opponent of slavery in any form. Stevens was not a moderate or a compromiser on the question of human bondage. He believed slavery was a moral evil that had to be destroyed root and branch. In Congress, Stevens opposed the Compromise of 1850, which allowed slavery to potentially expand into territories acquired from Mexico. He denounced the Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northerners to return escaped slaves to their masters. Stevens called it a betrayal of American principles of liberty and justice. His speeches on the House floor were legendary for their eloquence and their fury. He didn't simply argue against slavery on economic or political grounds. He attacked it as a sin against God and humanity. Stevens served in Congress until 1853, when he temporarily left politics, frustrated by the growing power of pro-slavery forces. But he couldn't stay away from the fight. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which threatened to extend slavery into new territories, brought Stevens back into the political arena. He joined the newly formed Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery. In 1858, Stevens was re-elected to Congress as a Republican. He would serve in the House of Representatives for the rest of his life, becoming one of the most powerful men in Washington. Stevens was older now, in his 60s, but his fire for justice burned hotter than ever. He became chairman of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee, which controlled government spending. This position gave him enormous influence over national policy. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the Southern states began to secede from the Union. Stevens had no sympathy for the secessionists. He believed they were traitors who should be treated as such. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Stevens immediately saw it as an opportunity not just to preserve the Union but to destroy slavery forever. He pushed Lincoln to make the war about emancipation from the very beginning. Lincoln was more cautious, wanting to keep the border states in the Union and not alienate Northern Democrats who supported the war but not abolition. Stevens grew impatient with Lincoln's gradualism. He wanted immediate emancipation and the arming of black soldiers to fight for their own freedom. As chairman of Ways and Means, Stevens controlled the purse strings for the war effort. He helped finance the massive military buildup that would eventually crush the Confederacy. Stevens supported the Legal Tender Act, which created paper money called greenbacks to pay for the war. He pushed through tax increases, including the first income tax in American history, to fund the Union Army. Stevens understood that winning the war required resources, and he was willing to use the full power of the federal government to marshal those resources. He didn't care about states' rights or limited government when it came to destroying slavery and preserving the Union. Stevens believed in using federal power to achieve justice and equality. In 1862, President Lincoln finally issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in the rebel states. Stevens applauded the move but thought it didn't go far enough. He wanted a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery everywhere in the United States. He wanted the government to confiscate the property of rebel slaveholders and redistribute it to the freed slaves. Stevens believed that freedom without economic independence was meaningless. He proposed giving every freed family 40 acres of land taken from the plantations of Confederate leaders. This was too radical even for most Republicans, and the plan was never implemented. But Stevens never stopped fighting for economic justice for the free people. Stevens was instrumental in passing the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the United States. The amendment passed Congress in January 1865, and Stevens celebrated it as the greatest achievement of his life. But he knew that ending slavery was just the first step. The freed people needed protection, education, and economic opportunity. As the Civil War ended in April 1865 with the surrender of Confederate forces, Stevens began planning for Reconstruction. He wanted to transform the South into a society based on equality and justice. He didn't want to simply restore the Union as it had been before the war. He wanted to create a new Union where black and white citizens had equal rights under law. Then President Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, 1865, just days after the war ended. Andrew Johnson, the vice president, became president. Johnson was a Tennessee Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, but he had no sympathy for black equality. Johnson wanted to quickly restore the Southern states to the Union with minimal changes to their social structure. He pardoned thousands of former Confederates and allowed them to regain political power. Stevens was horrified by Johnson's lenient policies toward the South. He watched as Southern states passed black codes that restricted the freedom of former slaves and kept them in a condition close to slavery. Stevens knew that without federal intervention, the fruits of Union victory would be lost. Stevens became the leader of the radical Republicans in Congress who opposed Johnson's Reconstruction policies. He was now in his 70s, but his energy and determination were undiminished. Stevens argued that the Confederate states had committed suicide by seceding and should be treated as conquered territories. He believed Congress, not the president, should control Reconstruction policy. In 1866, Stevens helped pass the Civil Rights Act over Johnson's veto. The act granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States and guaranteed equal protection under the law. It was a revolutionary piece of legislation that challenged centuries of racial hierarchy. Stevens also helped create the Freedmen's Bureau, which provided food, education, and legal assistance to former slaves. But Stevens wanted more permanent protections for black rights. He was the driving force behind the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which guaranteed citizenship and equal protection to all persons born in the United States. The amendment passed Congress in 1866, and Stevens worked tirelessly to secure its ratification by the states. He knew that constitutional amendments were harder to overturn than ordinary laws. The 14th Amendment became one of the most important additions to the Constitution, providing the legal foundation for civil rights for generations to come. Stevens didn't live to see all of its promise fulfilled, but he understood its significance. The conflict between Congress and President Johnson intensified throughout 1866 and 1867. Johnson vetoed bill after bill designed to protect the rights of free people. Congress overrode his vetoes again and again. Stevens was at the center of these battles, using his parliamentary skills and political cunning to outmaneuver the president. In March 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts over Johnson's veto. These acts divided the South into military districts and required Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment and grant black men the right to vote before they could be readmitted to the Union. It was a radical transformation of Southern society imposed by federal power. Stevens had pushed for even harsher measures, including the confiscation of rebel property, but he accepted this as a significant victory. President Johnson continued to obstruct congressional reconstruction at every turn. He removed military commanders who enforced the Reconstruction Acts too vigorously. He encouraged Southern whites to resist federal authority. Stevens and other radical Republicans decided that Johnson had to be removed from office. In February 1868, the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Andrew Johnson. Thaddeus Stevens, now 76 years old and in failing health, was one of the managers of the impeachment trial in the Senate. He had to be carried into the Senate chamber because he was too weak to walk. But his mind was still sharp and his commitment to justice unwavering. Stevens argued that Johnson had violated the law and betrayed his oath of office by obstructing Reconstruction. The impeachment trial was a dramatic confrontation between the legislative and executive branches. In May 1868, the Senate voted on whether to remove Johnson from office. The vote was 35-19 for conviction, just one vote short of the two-thirds majority required for removal. Johnson remained president, but his power was broken. Stevens was disappointed by the outcome, but he had succeeded in neutering Johnson's ability to undermine Reconstruction. The impeachment sent a message that Congress would not tolerate presidential obstruction of civil rights. By the summer of 1868, Thaddeus Stevens was dying. He had devoted his entire life to the cause of equality and justice. He had fought slavery when it was unpopular and dangerous to do so. He had helped win the Civil War and end slavery forever. He had pushed for constitutional amendments protecting the rights of all citizens. He had battled presidents and powerful interests to secure a measure of justice for the free people. Stevens knew his work was unfinished. He knew that white supremacy was deeply rooted in American society and would not be easily overcome. He worried that without continued federal protection, the gains of Reconstruction would be lost. His fears would prove prophetic. On August 11, 1868, Thaddeus Stevens died in Washington. He was 76 years old. In his will, he requested to be buried in a cemetery that accepted people of all races. He wanted his final resting place to reflect his lifelong commitment to equality. His gravestone in Lancaster, Pennsylvania bears an inscription he wrote himself: "I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited by charter rules as to race, I have chosen this that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated through a long life, equality of man before his Creator." Even in death, Stevens was making a statement about justice and human dignity. Stevens's legacy is complex and contested. To his supporters, he was a fearless champion of human rights who fought for the most oppressed people in American society. He used his political power to advance the cause of equality when most white Americans were indifferent or hostile to black rights. He helped write the constitutional amendments that provided the legal foundation for the civil rights movement a century later. Without Stevens and the radical Republicans, the 13th and 14th Amendments might never have been passed. These amendments transformed the Constitution from a document that protected slavery into one that promised equal citizenship for all. To his critics, Stevens was a vindictive radical who wanted to punish the South and impose racial equality by force. They accused him of corruption in his business dealings and of hypocrisy for living with a black woman while never publicly acknowledging their relationship. Some historians have portrayed Stevens as a dangerous extremist whose harsh Reconstruction policies poisoned relations between North and South for generations. But this criticism often comes from those who opposed racial equality and wanted to minimize the changes brought by the Civil War. Stevens understood that ending slavery required a fundamental transformation of Southern society, and he was willing to use federal power to achieve that transformation. Modern historians have generally been more sympathetic to Stevens and the radical Republicans. They recognized that Stevens was fighting for principles that were far ahead of his time. He believed in racial equality when most white Americans believed in white supremacy. He believed in using government power to protect the rights of the weak against the strong. He believed that democracy required not just political rights but also economic opportunity. His vision of a multiracial democracy based on equality before the law would not be realized in his lifetime. Reconstruction collapsed in the 1870s as Northern whites lost interest in protecting black rights and Southern whites used violence and intimidation to restore white supremacy. The failure of Reconstruction led to nearly a century of Jim Crow segregation in the South. Black Americans were denied the vote, relegated to inferior schools, and subjected to systematic discrimination and violence. The promise of the 14th Amendment was betrayed as the Supreme Court interpreted it narrowly and refused to protect black rights. It would take the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s to revive the radical Republican vision of equality. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Thurgood Marshall invoked the 14th Amendment and the principles of Reconstruction in their fight against segregation. They were, in a sense, completing the work that Thaddeus Stevens had begun. Stevens's commitment to equality extended beyond race. He was a champion of public education for all children regardless of their economic background. He believed that democracy required an educated citizenry and that the government had an obligation to provide free schools. His work establishing Pennsylvania's public school system in the 1830s was as important as his later work on Reconstruction. Stevens understood that political rights were meaningless without the education needed to exercise them effectively. He also supported women's property rights and other reforms that expanded individual liberty. What made Stevens such an effective political leader was his combination of moral conviction and practical political skill. He was a true believer in equality, but he was also a shrewd politician who knew how to count votes and make deals. He could be ruthless in pursuing his goals, using his control of congressional committees to reward allies and punish enemies. He was willing to compromise on tactics while never compromising on principles. Stevens understood that politics was about power and he was willing to use power to achieve justice. This made him different from some abolitionists who were pure in their principles but ineffective in achieving practical results. Stevens's personal life remained somewhat mysterious. He never married and lived for many years with Lydia Hamilton Smith, his housekeeper. Smith was a light-skinned black woman who managed his household and his business affairs. The nature of their relationship has been debated by historians. Some believe they were lovers, others that they were simply close friends and business partners. Stevens never publicly discussed his relationship with Smith and she remained discreet about their private life. What is clear is that Stevens trusted Smith completely and relied on her judgment. When he died, he left her a substantial portion of his estate. Stevens's clubfoot was a defining feature of his life. He was self-conscious about his disability and wore a wig to cover his baldness. Some historians have speculated that his physical disabilities made him sympathetic to others who were marginalized and oppressed. He knew what it was like to be marked as different and to face discrimination. This personal experience may have fueled his passion for equality and justice. Stevens never let his disabilities limit his ambitions or his effectiveness. He was a powerful public speaker despite his physical limitations, and he commanded respect through the force of his intellect and his moral authority. The ironworks that Stevens owned were attacked and burned by Confederate forces during the Gettysburg Campaign in 1863. The destruction of his property cost him thousands of dollars, but Stevens never sought compensation from the government. He saw his personal losses as a small price to pay for the cause of union and emancipation. The burning of his ironworks only strengthened his determination to punish the rebellion and transform Southern society. Stevens believed that the Confederate leadership should pay for the destruction they had caused and that their property should be confiscated and redistributed to the free people. Thaddeus Stevens died before he could see whether his vision of Reconstruction would succeed or fail. In the years immediately after his death, it seemed that the radical Republicans might achieve their goals. Black men voted and held office throughout the South. Integrated schools were established in some areas. The federal government used military force to protect black rights against white violence. But this progress was fragile and temporary. As federal troops were withdrawn from the South in the 1870s, white supremacists used terrorism and fraud to overthrow Reconstruction governments. By 1877, Reconstruction was effectively over and the promise of equality was betrayed. Yet Stevens's work was not in vain. The constitutional amendments he helped pass remained on the books even when they were not enforced. They provided the legal tools that future generations would use to fight for civil rights. The 14th Amendment in particular became the basis for landmark Supreme Court decisions like Brown v. Board of Education, which outlawed school segregation. Stevens's vision of a multiracial democracy based on equality before the law eventually triumphed, even though it took a century longer than he had hoped. His life stands as a testament to the power of moral conviction and political courage in the face of overwhelming opposition. John Wilkes Booth was a celebrated actor and Southern sympathizer who became one of history's most infamous assassins. John Wilkes Booth, the man who murdered President Abraham Lincoln, was born near Bel Air, Maryland on May 10, 1838. He came from America's most famous theatrical family. He had a striking appearance and magnetic stage presence. Booth's talent for performance was evident from childhood. He was educated at private academies until his teenage years, when the lure of the stage became irresistible. Then in 1855, his father died and the 17-year-old Booth began pursuing acting professionally, starting with small roles in Baltimore and Philadelphia theaters. John Wilkes Booth was a man of the South who owned no slaves himself but believed deeply in the Confederate cause. In 1858, when tensions between North and South were reaching a breaking point, Booth, now a rising star on the American stage, was performing in theaters across the country. Booth acted in Shakespearean plays throughout the late 1850s. When he was a young performer, he captivated audiences in cities from Richmond to Chicago. He became one of the highest-paid actors in America, and after achieving stardom, he was known for his passionate performances and his dark good looks. He was celebrated for his roles as villains and tragic heroes in the plays of Shakespeare. In 1859, Booth witnessed the execution of abolitionist John Brown in Virginia. Within months, he had joined a secret pro-Southern militia group and was becoming increasingly political in his views. Booth was not an intellectual like his brother Edwin or a moderate voice seeking compromise. He was a fervent extremist, if you will, who saw the conflict in absolute terms of Southern honor and Northern aggression. In early 1861, Booth was performing to sold-out crowds when the Civil War began. 1 month later, Fort Sumter fell to Confederate forces. Booth was literally the man on stage who used his celebrity status to move freely between North and South while secretly supporting the rebellion. In 1862, Booth's acting career reached its peak with performances in major cities including New York and Boston. The audiences loved him and critics praised his intensity, but within his heart Booth was consumed with rage over the war. John Wilkes Booth never enlisted in the Confederate Army, but he never stopped supporting their cause. He always found ways to aid the South from behind the lines. On November 9, 1863, Booth attended a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington where President Lincoln was present in the audience. Booth was using his access to theaters and his fame to plan something terrible, and no one suspected what he was contemplating. Booth began plotting to kidnap President Lincoln, but following the collapse of those schemes was a turn toward something far darker for the troubled actor. The fall of Richmond in April 1865 was the breaking point. That devastating defeat pushed Booth beyond kidnapping toward murder. Booth's strategy was all about striking a blow for the dying Confederacy. Booth recruited co-conspirators for what would become the last major crime of the Civil War. In April 1865, with Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Booth learned that Lincoln would attend a performance at Ford's Theater on April 14. On Good Friday, April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth entered Ford's Theater in Washington carrying a pistol and a knife. Booth was the only assassin who successfully completed his mission that night as part of a larger conspiracy. Booth led himself into the presidential box during a performance of Our American Cousin. He knew the theater intimately from his years on stage, and he used that knowledge to approach the president unseen. On that terrible night, Booth shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln never regained consciousness and died the following morning at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. Booth leaped from the presidential box to the stage below. breaking his leg in the fall, and shouted in Latin before escaping into the night. The nation was plunged into grief and shock. Washington was thrown into chaos as the manhunt began immediately. Booth fled on horseback into Maryland with his accomplice David Herold. For 12 days Booth evaded capture while the largest manhunt in American history pursued him. Booth and Herold hid in tobacco barns and safe houses provided by Confederate sympathizers. They crossed the Potomac River into Virginia seeking refuge in the defeated South. Booth kept a diary during his escape in which he justified his actions and portrayed himself as a patriot. He wrote that he had struck down a tyrant just as Brutus had killed Caesar. Booth believed history would vindicate him and celebrate him as a hero of the South. He could not have been more wrong about how he would be remembered. Federal troops tracked Booth to a tobacco barn on the Garrett Farm near Port Royal, Virginia on April 26, 1865. The barn was surrounded before dawn and the soldiers demanded Booth surrender. Booth refused to give himself up peacefully. He wanted to die fighting rather than face capture and execution. David Herold surrendered, but Booth remained defiant inside the barn. The troops set fire to the barn to force him out into the open. Through the flames and smoke, Sergeant Boston Corbett spotted Booth and fired a single shot. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spine and paralyzing him. Soldiers dragged the dying assassin from the burning barn onto the porch of the farmhouse. Booth lingered for several hours, unable to move or speak clearly. He asked the soldiers to tell his mother he died for his country. He looked at his hands and whispered his final words, asking them to be lifted up so he could see them. John Wilkes Booth died on the morning of April 26, 1865, 12 days after he murdered Abraham Lincoln. He was 26 years old. His body was secretly buried to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine for Confederate sympathizers. Booth's co-conspirators were captured, tried, and 4 were hanged, including Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the federal government. The Booth family name, once synonymous with theatrical greatness, became forever associated with infamy and tragedy. Edwin Booth, John Wilkes's older brother and the greatest actor of his generation, was devastated by his brother's crime. He temporarily retired from the stage in shame and grief. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln changed the course of American history and the process of Reconstruction in the South. Many historians believe that Lincoln's death removed the one leader who might have reunited the nation with compassion rather than vengeance. John Wilkes Booth believed he was serving a noble cause and defending Southern civilization. He saw himself as a hero striking down a dictator who had destroyed the Southern way of life. Booth was raised in a border state where loyalties were divided and passions ran deep. His family was split between Union and Confederate sympathies, with his brothers supporting the North while John embraced the South. Booth's father, Junius Brutus Booth, was a famous Shakespearean actor known for his brilliant but erratic performances. The elder Booth struggled with alcoholism and mental instability throughout his life. He named his son after the English radical John Wilkes, a defender of liberty against royal tyranny. The irony of that name would become apparent when John Wilkes Booth himself became a tyrant who murdered a democratically elected president. Young John Wilkes grew up on a farm in Maryland surrounded by the institution of slavery. Though his family did not own many slaves, Booth absorbed the racial attitudes of the South. He believed in white supremacy and the inferiority of African Americans. The thought of freed slaves achieving equality with whites filled him with horror and rage. Booth's acting career began in earnest in 1857 when he joined a theater company in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond would become like a second home to him and the heart of the Confederacy he loved. He performed there regularly and formed deep friendships with Southern sympathizers and Confederate agents. By 1860, Booth was earning substantial money from his performances and was recognized as a major talent. He was especially acclaimed for his athletic stage presence and his ability to perform dangerous stunts. Audiences thrilled to his energetic sword fights and dramatic leaps during performances. Some critics compared him favorably to his more famous brother Edwin, though others found his style too melodramatic. Booth was vain about his appearance and conscious of his effect on women. He had numerous romantic relationships and was engaged at least once, though he never married. Women found him irresistible with his dark curly hair, pale skin, and intense eyes. He used his charm to manipulate people and gain access to places he needed to go. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Booth was performing in Albany, New York. He was one of the few prominent actors who openly supported the Confederacy while working in northern cities. This was dangerous and required him to be careful about how publicly he expressed his views. Booth's decision not to enlist in the Confederate Army has never been fully explained. Some historians suggest he promised his mother he would not fight. Others believe he thought he could serve the South better as a civilian with freedom of movement. Still others think he was simply too fond of his comfortable life as a celebrity to risk it in combat. Whatever the reason, Booth's failure to serve haunted him throughout the war. He felt guilty that other men were fighting and dying while he performed on stage. This guilt may have driven him toward increasingly extreme actions to prove his loyalty to the South. In 1864, Booth began organizing a conspiracy to kidnap President Lincoln and take him to Richmond. The plan was to hold Lincoln hostage and exchange him for Confederate prisoners of war. Booth recruited several co-conspirators including Samuel Arnold, Michael A. Laughlin, John Surratt, David Herold, George Atzerodt, and Lewis Powell. The kidnapping plot went through several iterations but none succeeded. On one occasion in March 1865, Booth and his conspirators waited to ambush Lincoln's carriage, but the president changed his plans at the last moment. The failure of the kidnapping schemes frustrated Booth and pushed him toward more violent thoughts. The fall of Richmond on April 3, 1865 devastated Booth emotionally. He had been in the Confederate capital just weeks before and now it was in Union hands. The Confederacy he loved was collapsing around him and he felt desperate to strike some blow for the cause. When Booth learned that General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox on April 9, he knew the war was effectively over. The South had lost everything and Lincoln's government would now reshape Southern society. Booth could not accept this outcome and decided that killing Lincoln might somehow revive the Confederate cause or at least avenge its defeat. On April 14, Booth learned that Lincoln would attend a performance of the comedy Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater that evening. Booth knew Ford's Theater intimately because he had performed there many times. He knew every hallway, every door, and every exit. He also knew that the theater owner would not question his presence in the building. Booth spent the day making final preparations for the assassination. He met with his co-conspirators and assigned them targets. Lewis Powell was to kill Secretary of State William Seward at his home. George Atzerodt was to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at his hotel. Booth himself would kill Lincoln at the theater. Only Booth succeeded in his mission that night. Around 10:15 p.m., Booth entered the presidential box at Ford's Theater while the play was in progress. Lincoln's bodyguard had left his post to get a drink at a nearby tavern. Booth barred the door to the box from inside so no one could enter quickly. He approached Lincoln from behind and fired a single shot from his Derringer pistol into the back of the president's head. The bullet entered behind Lincoln's left ear and lodged behind his right eye. Lincoln slumped forward in his chair, mortally wounded. Mary Todd Lincoln screamed as Booth jumped from the box to the stage below. Major Henry Rathbone, who was in the box with the Lincolns, tried to stop Booth but was slashed with a knife. Booth landed awkwardly on the stage and broke the fibular bone in his left leg. Despite the injury, he stood and shouted Sic semper tyrannis, which means thus always to tyrants in Latin. Some witnesses reported he also shouted the South is avenged, though this is disputed. Booth then limped across the stage and out the back door where a horse was waiting. He mounted the horse and rode off into the night, beginning his flight from justice. The audience was initially confused about what had happened. Some thought it was part of the play. But when Mary Todd Lincoln's screams continued and people saw the president's condition, panic erupted in the theater. Doctors in the audience rushed to help Lincoln, but there was nothing they could do. The bullet had caused massive brain damage and Lincoln would never regain consciousness. He was carried across the street to a boarding house where he was laid diagonally across a bed that was too short for his tall frame. Cabinet members, family, and government officials gathered through the night to keep vigil as Lincoln slowly died. Booth meanwhile was riding hard toward Maryland with David Herold. They stopped at Syat's Tavern to pick up supplies that had been hidden there earlier. Then they continued to the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who set Booth's broken leg and provided shelter. Dr. Mudd would later be convicted as a co-conspirator, though he claimed he did not recognize Booth. Booth and Herold hid in the woods for several days while thousands of soldiers searched for them. They were aided by Confederate sympathizers who provided food and shelter. Booth was in constant pain from his broken leg and could not move quickly. He read newspapers and was shocked to discover he was being condemned as a murderer rather than celebrated as a hero. The country was united in grief and outrage over Lincoln's assassination. Even many Southerners who had hated Lincoln condemned Booth's action as dishonorable. Booth had expected to be hailed as a hero but instead found himself reviled as a coward and assassin. His diary entries from this period show his growing desperation and his inability to understand why he was not being praised. Booth and Herold finally crossed the Potomac River into Virginia on April 23 after several failed attempts. They were seeking refuge in the defeated South but found that even there they were not welcome. Most Confederates wanted to put the war behind them and saw Booth as an obstacle to reconciliation. The two fugitives made their way to the Garrett farm near Port Royal, Virginia. They told the Garrett family a false story about being Confederate soldiers heading home. The Garretts allowed them to sleep in their tobacco barn. But the Garretts became suspicious of their guests and locked them in the barn on the night of April 25. Federal troops arrived at the Garrett farm early on the morning of April 26. They had been tracking Booth through informants and clues left along his escape route. The troops surrounded the barn and ordered Booth to surrender. Booth refused and tried to negotiate, asking for time and offering to fight the soldiers one by one. The troops rejected his offers and threatened to burn the barn. David Herold lost his nerve and surrendered, but Booth remained inside. The troops set fire to the barn, and as the flames grew, they could see Booth inside holding a carbine rifle. Sergeant Boston Corbett claimed he fired at Booth because he saw him raising the rifle to shoot. The bullet struck Booth in the neck and he fell to the ground paralyzed. Soldiers dragged him from the burning barn and laid him on the porch of the farmhouse. Booth could not move anything below his neck and had difficulty breathing and speaking. He lingered for about 3 hours as the sun rose on what would be his last day. He asked repeatedly for his hands to be lifted so he could see them. Finally he whispered "useless, useless," and died around 7 in the morning. John Wilkes Booth's body was taken back to Washington and positively identified. He was buried secretly in a warehouse at the Washington Arsenal to prevent his grave from becoming a Confederate shrine. In 1869, his remains were released to his family and reburied in an unmarked grave in Baltimore. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was a tragedy that affected the entire nation and changed the course of history. Lincoln's vision of a lenient Reconstruction that would heal the nation's wounds died with him. His successor Andrew Johnson lacked Lincoln's political skill and moral authority. The radical Republicans in Congress took control of Reconstruction and imposed harsh measures on the defeated South. This created resentment and resistance that lasted for generations. John Wilkes Booth achieved the opposite of what he intended. Instead of helping the South, he made its recovery more difficult and painful. Instead of being remembered as a hero, he became a symbol of fanaticism and murder. His family name was dishonored and his brother Edwin had to live with the shame of his actions. Booth's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of extremism and the consequences of political violence. He was a talented man who threw away his gifts and his life for a cause that was already lost. He convinced himself that murder was justified and that history would vindicate him. He was wrong on both counts, and his name will forever be associated with one of the darkest moments in American history.